The boardroom was empty except for the two of them. Andrew had asked her to meet him here. 7th floor. His new office building. The one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Catherine stood by the glass watching the traffic below, tiny cars moving like insects. She heard him enter behind her. The click of expensive shoes on marble. The rustle of papers. When she turned around, he was sitting at the head of the conference table. Not standing. Not greeting her. Just sitting. Waiting. Like she was a client. Like she was nobody. "Thank you for coming," Andrew said. His voice was different. Formal. The voice he used with investors. With strangers. Catherine walked toward the table but didn't sit. She stayed standing. Close enough to see his face clearly. Far enough to maintain distance. She'd learned a long time ago that positioning mattered. That power lived in the small choices. Where you stood. How you held yourself. Whether you smiled or stayed silent. "You said it was important," she replied. "It is." Andrew slid a folder across the polished wood. Navy blue. Embossed with a law firm's logo she didn't recognize. Everything about this moment felt rehearsed. Staged. Like he'd practiced it in front of a mirror. Maybe he had. Maybe his attorney had coached him on how to do this. How to end a marriage in a conference room at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. "I need you to understand something," he continued. "This isn't personal. This is about moving forward. About building the life I've worked for." The life he'd worked for. Catherine looked down at the folder. She didn't touch it. Not yet. She just stood there. Watching him. Studying the man she'd married 11 years ago. The man who used to stay up until 3 in the morning working on pitches. The man who used to ask her opinion on everything. On contracts. On clients. On whether a deal was worth taking. That man was gone. The person sitting across from her now was someone else. Someone who'd tasted success and decided it was his alone. Someone who'd forgotten how he got there. "Open it," Andrew said. Not a request. An instruction. Catherine picked up the folder. Opened it slowly. Inside were divorce papers. Neatly organized. Tabbed. Highlighted in yellow where she needed to sign. She scanned the first page. Then the second. The settlement terms were there. Written in legal language that was meant to sound generous but wasn't. The house would stay in his name. She'd get a buyout. Enough to live comfortably. Not enough to challenge him. Not enough to remind him that she'd been there from the beginning. That every connection he had. Every strategy he used. Every door that opened for him, she'd been the one opening it. "This is what you want?" Catherine asked quietly. "This is what makes sense." "What makes sense?" She nodded. Let the words sit between them. Let the silence stretch. Andrew shifted in his chair. Uncomfortable. He'd expected her to react. To cry. To argue. To make this difficult. That's what he'd prepared for. His attorney had probably given him a whole script for managing her emotions. For de-escalating. For getting her to sign quickly before she realized what she was giving up. But Catherine didn't give him any of that. She just closed the folder. Set it back on the table. And looked at him with eyes that gave nothing away. "When did you decide this?" she asked. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Andrew leaned back in his chair. Crossed his arms. The posture of someone who'd already won. Someone who thought the hard part was over. "The Meridian deal changed things," he said. $55 million. That kind of contract, it opens doors. It creates opportunities. And I need to be positioned correctly to take advantage of them. Positioned correctly. Catherine understood. She wasn't part of that positioning anymore. She was the wife from the startup days. The woman who'd maxed out credit cards to keep the business afloat. The woman who'd made calls and set up meetings and drafted proposals at midnight while he slept. None of that mattered now. Now he needed someone different. Someone younger. Someone who looked better in photographs. Someone who fit the image of success he wanted to project. She'd seen the Instagram posts. The charity galas. The new assistant who laughed at all his jokes. 26 years old. Blonde. Perfect. "I see," Catherine said. "I knew you'd understand. You've always been practical." Practical. That was the word he used. Not loyal. Not brilliant. Not essential. Practical. like she was a good investment that had run its course, like it was time to liquidate and move on. "I'll need time to review this with my attorney," Catherine said. Andrew's expression shifted. Just slightly. A tightness around his mouth. He hadn't expected resistance. Even small resistance. "You don't have an attorney." "I will by this afternoon." The boardroom went very quiet. Outside, a helicopter passed. The sound filtered through the thick glass. Distant. Muted. Andrew uncrossed his arms. Leaned forward. Put his elbows on the table. The posture of someone trying to appear reasonable. Trying to seem like they were being fair. "Catherine, this offer is more than generous. My attorney says." "I don't care what your attorney says." Her voice was calm. Even. But there was steel underneath. Andrew heard it. She could see him register it. See him realize that maybe this wasn't going to be as simple as he'd planned. That maybe she wasn't going to just disappear quietly. That maybe, just maybe, she knew something he didn't. "What do you want?" he asked. Catherine picked up the folder again. Held it. Felt the weight of all those pages. All those clauses designed to protect him. To limit her. To make sure she could never come back and claim what was rightfully hers. And she smiled. Not a big smile. Just a small one. The kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "I want you to read the Meridian contract again," she said. Carefully this time. Andrew stared at her. Confused. Defensive. "I've read it 100 times. It's airtight. 55 million over 5 years. Exclusive partnership. It's the deal of a lifetime." "It is," Catherine agreed. "But did you read who you signed it with?" "Meridian Industries." "Obviously. Did you check who owns Meridian Industries?" The question hung in the air. Andrew's face went blank. Then confused. Then something else. Something that looked like the beginning of fear. Catherine watched it happen. Watched him try to remember. Try to recall the details of the contract signing 5 days ago. The celebration afterward. The champagne. The congratulations. The photos. The press release. He'd been so focused on the number. On the prestige. On what it meant for his future. He hadn't asked the questions he should have asked. He just signed. "What are you talking about?" His voice was quieter now. Catherine set the folder down. Walked toward the door. Stopped. Turned back. Looked at her husband sitting alone at that big conference table. Looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. "Call your attorney," she said. "Have him pull the corporate filings for Meridian. Then call me." She left. Didn't wait for his response. Didn't need to. She'd seen everything she needed to see in his eyes. The confusion. The doubt. The first crack in his certainty. By tonight that crack would be a chasm. By tomorrow his whole world would be different. And he'd understand exactly what he'd thrown away when he threw her out. What Andrew didn't know. What he couldn't have known because he'd stopped asking her advice 6 months ago. Was that Meridian Industries wasn't just another tech conglomerate. It was a carefully structured acquisition vehicle. And 3 months ago, when Andrew was too busy celebrating his success to notice, Catherine had quietly purchased 70% of its shares through a trust. The same trust she'd set up 7 years ago. The trust Andrew had forgotten about. The trust he'd signed over to her as a tax shelter. The trust that now controlled the company he just signed a $55 million contract with. Which meant every dollar he made. Every milestone he hit. Every success he celebrated for the next 5 years belonged to her. But Catherine wasn't going to tell him that. Not yet. She was going to let him figure it out on his own. Let him feel what it was like to realize you'd made a terrible mistake. Let him understand that the person you underestimate is often the person who destroys you. She walked out of the building. Got into her car. A modest sedan. Nothing flashy. Nothing that drew attention. That was Catherine's way. Always had been. Stay quiet. Stay patient. Let everyone else make noise while you did the work. While you built the foundations. While you created the structures that would matter later. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Chen. Her attorney. Her friend. The only person who knew what was about to happen. "He'll call in 3 hours. Maybe less. Are you ready?" Catherine typed back quickly. "I've been ready for months." She started the car. Pulled out of the parking garage. drove toward the law offices downtown where Marcus was waiting, where the real paperwork was, the documents that mattered, the contracts that would change everything. Not Andrew's divorce papers. Those were just theater. A distraction. What mattered was the Meridian contract. The clauses she'd written into it. The protections she'd built in. The leverage she now held. Andrew thought he was getting divorced. He thought he was starting over. He thought he was finally free. But what he was actually doing was handing her everything. His company. His reputation. His future. All of it. And he'd done it willingly. Eagerly. With a smile on his face. Because he'd been so certain. So confident. So completely convinced that he was smarter than everyone around him. That was his mistake. That was always his mistake. He looked at Catherine and saw someone soft. Someone quiet. Someone who wouldn't fight back. He looked at her and saw the woman who supported him. Who built him up. Who never asked for credit. And he thought that meant she was weak. That she was passive. That she would just accept whatever he decided. He'd forgotten that quiet doesn't mean powerless. That patience isn't the same as submission. That the person who doesn't need to be the loudest is often the person with the most control. If you're watching this and thinking Catherine is about to take everything, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what you would do in her situation. And subscribe because this story is just getting started. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when Andrew finally reads that contract. Let's get into it. 3 hours later, Catherine was sitting in Marcus's office when her phone rang. Andrew. She looked at Marcus. He nodded. She answered. Catherine. Andrew's voice was tight. Strained. We need to talk. I thought we already did. No. I mean, we need to talk right now. In person. Where are you? I'm with my attorney. Silence. Then Andrew spoke again. Slower now. Like he was trying very hard to stay calm. Who owns Meridian Industries? I think you know the answer to that question. Catherine, if this is some kind of game. It's not a game, Andrew. It's business. You taught me that. Everything is business. Even marriage. Even divorce. You said that yourself. Remember. She heard him breathing on the other end. Heard the controls starting to slip. The confidence cracking. We need to talk about this, he said. We will. Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Marcus Chin's office. Downtown. You know where it is. Tomorrow? Catherine, this can't wait until. Tomorrow, she repeated. Then she hung up. Marcus was watching her. His expression neutral. Professional. But she could see the hint of satisfaction in his eyes. He'd worked with Andrew before. Years ago. When the company was just starting. He'd seen how Andrew treated people. How he took credit. How he discarded anyone who wasn't immediately useful. Marcus had been one of those people. Until Catherine hired him back. Quietly. Without telling Andrew. 6 months ago. Right around the time she started building her contingency plan. He sounds worried, Marcus said. He should be. Are you sure you want to do this? Once we move forward with the filing, there's no going back. Catherine looked out the window. At the city below. At all the buildings and people and lives happening simultaneously. Somewhere out there, Andrew was probably calling his attorney. Probably demanding answers. Probably trying to figure out how this happened. How he'd missed something so obvious. How the woman he'd underestimated for 11 years had outmaneuvered him completely. I'm sure, Catherine said. Marcus nodded. Pulled out a stack of documents. Began walking her through each one. The corporate filings. The trust agreements. The contract clauses. Everything was there. Everything was perfect. Catherine had spent months building this. Making sure every detail was correct. Making sure there were no gaps. No loopholes. No way for Andrew to escape what was coming. The truth was simple. When Andrew signed the Meridian contract, he'd signed away control of his own company. Buried in the fine print. Hidden in clauses about partnership requirements and operational oversight. Was language that gave Meridian Industries, which meant Catherine, the right to approve all major business decisions. All major hires and fires. All major expenditures over $100,000. Andrew had signed it without reading. Without questioning. Because he trusted Meridian. because they were offering him $55 million. Because he thought he was winning. But he wasn't winning. He was signing away everything. And the beautiful part, the part that Catherine had crafted so carefully, was that he couldn't even break the contract. Not without paying a penalty. A penalty that would bankrupt him. A penalty that would destroy everything he'd built. He was trapped. And he'd trapped himself. With his own ambition. With his own greed. With his own absolute certainty that he deserved more than what he had. Catherine had given him exactly what he wanted. Success. Prestige. Money. Recognition. She'd handed it to him on a silver platter. And in return she'd taken something far more valuable. Control. The one thing Andrew valued above everything else. The one thing he thought he'd never lose. And now it was hers. That night Catherine went home. Not to the house she'd shared with Andrew. She'd already moved out. 3 weeks ago. Quietly. Without drama. She'd packed her things while he was at the office. Left a note on the counter. Short. Simple. I'll be staying with my sister. Call when you're ready to talk. He hadn't called. Not once. He'd probably been relieved. Probably thought she was making things easy for him. Removing herself from his life before he even had to ask. The apartment she'd rented was small. 1 bedroom. Nothing fancy. But it was hers. And that mattered more than size or luxury. She made herself dinner. Pasta. Simple. Ate it while reading through emails. Business emails. From clients Andrew didn't know she still had. From contacts she'd maintained. From opportunities she'd been cultivating. For months. While he was busy celebrating. While he was busy planning his new life. Catherine had been building her own. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. Diane. How did it go? Catherine typed back. Better than expected. He still doesn't understand how bad it is. When will he? Tomorrow. When Marcus explains it to him. Are you okay? Catherine stared at that question. Was she okay? She didn't know. She felt numb. Not angry. Not sad. Just empty. Like the past 11 years had been erased. Like she'd invested everything into something that had just evaporated. But underneath that numbness was something else. Something harder. Something that had been growing for months. Determination. The realization that she'd wasted enough time. That she'd given enough. That it was time to take back what was hers. I'm fine, she typed. I'll call you tomorrow. She set her phone down. Walked to the window. Looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there Andrew was probably panicking. Probably calling lawyers. Probably trying to find a way out. But there wasn't one. Catherine had made sure of that. Every door was closed. Every exit blocked. Every option eliminated. He could fight. He could sue. He could scream and rage and demand justice. But none of it would matter. Because the law was on her side. The contracts were clear. And the truth was simple. He'd made a choice. And now he had to live with it. The next morning, Catherine arrived at Marcus's office at 9:30. Early. But not too early. She wanted time to prepare. To center herself. To make sure she was ready for whatever Andrew brought. Marcus was already there. Coffee made. Documents organized. He'd always been thorough. That's why she'd hired him. That's why she trusted him. He's bringing his attorney, Marcus said. Paul Davidson. Big firm. Expensive. I know who he is. He's good. So are you. Marcus smiled. Fair enough. But just so you know, this could get ugly. Andrew's not going to take this well. And Davidson's going to look for any way to challenge the contract. Any ambiguity. Any loophole. There aren't any. I know. But they're going to try anyway. Catherine sat down. Smoothed her skirt. She dressed carefully this morning. Professional. Conservative. Nothing flashy. She wanted to look like someone who belonged in a boardroom. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Someone who couldn't be intimidated or pushed around. At 10 o'clock exactly, Andrew arrived. He wasn't alone. Paul Davidson was with him. Tall. Silver hair. Expensive suit. The kind of lawyer who charged $1,000 an hour and made sure you knew it. They walked into the conference room like they owned it. Andrew's face was hard. controlled. But Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders. The way he held himself too rigidly. He was barely keeping it together. "Catherine," Andrew said. Not a greeting. Just an acknowledgement. "Andrew." They sat across from each other. Marcus on Catherine's side. Davidson on Andrew's. Like negotiators. Like enemies. Which Catherine supposed is what they were now. Davidson spoke first. "I've reviewed the Meridian contract. And I have to say, Mrs. Harper, this is highly unusual. Bordering on fraudulent." Marcus didn't even blink. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that she concealed her ownership of Meridian Industries. That she knowingly entered into a contract with her husband without disclosing a material conflict of interest. That she manipulated him into signing something he wouldn't have signed if he'd known the truth. Mr. Harper signed a legally binding contract with a legitimate corporate entity," Marcus replied calmly. "The fact that his wife happens to own that entity doesn't make the contract invalid. He had every opportunity to conduct due diligence, to ask questions, to review the corporate structure. He chose not to. That's not Mrs. Harper's responsibility." Davidson's jaw tightened. "This will never hold up in court." "Then take it to court," Marcus said. "But I think you'll find that every clause, every provision, every line of that contract is completely enforceable. And if Mr. Harper attempts to break it, he'll owe Meridian Industries, which is to say, Mrs. Harper, a penalty of $30 million. Plus legal fees. Plus damages. Is that really the road you want to go down?" The room went silent. Andrew was staring at Catherine. His eyes were hard. Angry. But underneath that she could see something else. Confusion. Hurt. Like he couldn't understand how she'd done this. How she'd outplayed him. How the woman he dismissed had somehow become the person holding all the cards. "Why?" Andrew asked. His voice was quiet. Almost vulnerable. "Why would you do this?" Catherine looked at him. Really looked at him. At the man she'd loved. The man she'd built a life with. The man who decided she wasn't worth keeping. "You threw me away," she said simply. "You decided I wasn't useful anymore. That I didn't fit into your new life. So I made sure you'd regret that decision. Not because I hate you, Andrew. But because you needed to understand what you lost. This is insane. You can't just." "I already did." Andrew slammed his hand on the table. Not hard. But enough to make a sound. Enough to show he was losing control. "You're destroying me." "No," Catherine said calmly. "I'm holding you accountable. There's a difference." Davidson leaned forward. "Mrs. Harper, let's be reasonable here. What do you want? Money? A bigger settlement? Name your price." "I don't want money." "Then what?" Catherine pulled out a folder. Her folder. Not the divorce papers Andrew had given her. Something else. She slid it across the table. Andrew opened it. Started reading. His face went pale. Inside were counterterms. Not a settlement. A proposal. Catherine would maintain her 70% ownership of Meridian. Andrew would continue to run his company. But every major decision would require her approval. Every hire. Every contract. Every strategy. He'd report to her. Quarterly. Monthly if necessary. And if he wanted out. If he wanted to buy back control. The price was $75 million. Cash. Up front. Catherine had quietly purchased 70% of its shares through a trust. The same trust she'd set up 7 years ago. The trust Andrew had forgotten about. The trust he'd signed over to her as a tax shelter. The trust that now controlled the company he just signed a $55 million contract with. Which meant every dollar he made. Every milestone he hit. Every success he celebrated for the next 5 years belonged to her. But Catherine wasn't going to tell him that. Not yet. She was going to let him figure it out on his own. Let him feel what it was like to realize you'd made a terrible mistake. Let him understand that the person you underestimate is often the person who destroys you. She walked out of the building. Got into her car. A modest sedan. Nothing flashy. Nothing that drew attention. That was Catherine's way. Always had been. Stay quiet. Stay patient. Let everyone else make noise while you did the work. While you built the foundations. While you created the structures that would matter later. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Chen, her attorney, her friend, the only person who knew what was about to happen. He'll call in 3 hours. Maybe less. Are you ready? Catherine typed back quickly. I've been ready for months. She started the car, pulled out of the parking garage, drove toward the law offices downtown where Marcus was waiting, where the real paperwork was, the documents that mattered, the contracts that would change everything. Not Andrew's divorce papers. Those were just theater. A distraction. What mattered was the Meridian contract. The clauses she'd written into it. The protections she'd built in. The leverage she now held. Andrew thought he was getting divorced. He thought he was starting over. He thought he was finally free. But what he was actually doing was handing her everything. His company. His reputation. His future. All of it. And he'd done it willingly. Eagerly. With a smile on his face. Like she'd just run a marathon. But she also felt something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Power. Control. The certainty that she'd won. Not just the contract. Not just the money. But something more important. Her dignity. Her future. Herself. How do you feel? Marcus asked. Catherine thought about it. I feel free. Over the next 48 hours, Catherine didn't hear from Andrew. No calls. No texts. No attempts to negotiate. She wondered if he was going to fight. If he was going to take his chances in court. If he was going to call her bluff. But she wasn't bluffing. She'd meant every word. And Marcus had made sure the contracts were bulletproof. There was no way out. Not without destroying himself. She spent those 2 days working. Reaching out to old clients. Reconnecting with contacts. Building the foundation for what came next. Because regardless of what Andrew decided, Catherine was moving forward. She was starting her own consulting firm. Small at first. Just her. But with the right clients. With the right projects. It would grow. And unlike Andrew's company, it would be built on something real. Not flash. Not image. Substance. On the morning of the 3rd day, her phone rang. Paul Davidson. Mrs. Harper. Mr. Harper has agreed to your terms. Catherine closed her eyes. Let herself feel the victory for just a moment. Then she opened them. Put it in writing. Have him sign it. And send it to Marcus by end of business today. Understood. She hung up. Sat down. Let the reality sink in. It was over. She'd won. Andrew would stay. He'd run his company. But she'd own him. Every decision. Every move. Every success. It would all come back to her. And he'd have to live with that. Day after day. Year after year. He'd have to wake up knowing that the woman he'd thrown away was the one holding his leash. Some people might call it revenge. Catherine called it justice. 3 weeks later, Catherine was in her new office. Small. Modest. But hers. She'd signed her first client that morning. A tech startup looking for strategic consulting. Nothing huge. But it was a start. And that's all she needed. A start. The rest would come. She knew how to build things. How to create value. How to make connections. She'd done it for Andrew. Now she'd do it for herself. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it. I underestimated you. That was my mistake. Congratulations on your new company. Catherine stared at the message. Read it twice. Then she deleted it. She didn't need Andrew's acknowledgement. She didn't need his congratulations. She didn't need anything from him anymore. That chapter was closed. She'd moved on. But there was something he didn't know yet. Something even Marcus didn't know. Catherine had been planning this for longer than 6 months. Much longer. The truth was, she'd started building her exit strategy almost 2 years ago. When Andrew first started changing. When he first started treating her like an assistant instead of a partner. When she first realized that the man she'd married wasn't coming back. Over those 2 years, she'd quietly diverted some of their joint assets. Not illegally. Everything was documented. Everything was clean. But she'd moved money into accounts Andrew didn't monitor. She'd created investment vehicles he didn't know existed. She'd built a financial foundation completely separate from him. And now, with the Meridian contract and the divorce settlement in her new company, Catherine wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. She had more money than Andrew knew about, more connections, more leverage. And if he ever tried to challenge her again, if he ever tried to fight back or take back control, she had more ammunition. Documents, emails, records of every shady deal, every corner cut, every rule bent. Not illegal, but close. Things that would damage his reputation if they became public. Things his clients wouldn't like. Things his investors would run from. Catherine had built an insurance policy, and Andrew didn't even know it existed. That was the real twist. The real surprise. Everyone thought Catherine had one when she revealed she owned Meridian. But that was just the surface. The deeper truth, the real checkmate, was that she'd been 10 steps ahead the entire time. And by the time Andrew realized just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered, it would be too late. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, Catherine's consulting firm had grown. 5 employees, 12 clients, revenue projections that would make her independently wealthy within 3 years. She'd done it. She'd rebuilt. Without Andrew. Without anyone. Just herself. Her intelligence. Her work ethic. Her refusal to give up. She heard through the grapevine that Andrew was struggling, that the Meridian contract was more demanding than he'd anticipated, that having to get approval for every major decision was slowing him down, that his competitors were starting to gain ground. Some people felt sorry for him. Catherine didn't. He'd made his choices. Now he was living with them. One evening, she was leaving the office late when she ran into someone unexpected. Jessica, Andrew's new girlfriend. The 26-year-old assistant who'd replaced Catherine in his life. She was standing outside the building, crying, mascara running down her face. "Are you okay?" Catherine asked. Not because she cared, but because it seemed like the right thing to say. Jessica looked up. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "You're Catherine." "I am. I'm sorry. About everything. About, you know." Catherine studied her. This young woman who'd probably been dazzled by Andrew's success, who'd probably thought she was stepping into a fairy tale, who was now learning that fairy tales don't exist. "What happened?" Catherine asked. "He's leaving me," Jessica said. "He said I don't fit anymore. That he needs someone more mature. Someone who understands business. He said." She paused, wiped her eyes. "He said I'm not like you." Catherine felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just sadness. Sadness that Andrew hadn't learned anything. That he was still the same person. Still using people. Still discarding them when they stopped being useful. And this young woman, this girl who'd probably thought she was special, was learning the same lesson Catherine had learned. That Andrew only loved himself. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. And she meant it. Jessica nodded. Wiped her eyes again. Then she looked at Catherine with something like hope. "How did you move on? How did you survive?" Catherine thought about that question. About all the nights she'd cried. All the doubts she'd had. All the moments she'd wanted to give up. And then she thought about where she was now. About what she'd built. About who she'd become. "I remembered who I was before him," Catherine said. "And I became someone better." Jessica nodded. Sniffled. Then she walked away. And Catherine watched her go. Watched another woman learn the hard way what Catherine had learned. That you can't build a life on someone else's foundation. That you have to stand on your own. That the only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Catherine went home that night feeling something she hadn't expected. Closure. Not because she'd destroyed Andrew. Not because she'd won. But because she'd finally let go. She'd stopped caring what he thought. Stopped measuring her worth by his opinion. Stopped giving him power over her life. She'd taken everything back. Her name. Her dignity. Her future. And in doing so, she'd become the person she was always meant to be. Not Andrew's wife. Not Andrew's partner. Just Catherine. Strong. Independent. Unbreakable. And that was worth more than $55 million. That was worth everything. If this story hit you the way I think it did, if you're sitting there thinking about the people in your life who underestimated you, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because I'm bringing you more stories like this. Stories about people who got knocked down and came back stronger. Stories about justice, revenge, and the power of patience. A year after everything fell apart and came back together, Catherine was sitting in a board meeting. Not Andrew's board. Her own. She'd taken her consulting firm public. Small offering, but successful. And now she had investors, partners, a real company, a real future. Her phone buzzed during the meeting. She ignored it, but when the meeting ended, she checked. It was a news alert. Andrew Harper's company files for bankruptcy protection. Meridian deal collapses amid financial irregularities. Catherine stared at the headline. Read the article. Apparently, Andrew had been hiding losses, overstating revenue, trying to maintain the appearance of success while everything crumbled beneath him. And when the auditors came in, when the truth came out, everything fell apart. The Meridian contract was terminated. The penalty was enforced. And Andrew couldn't pay. So now he was bankrupt. His company was being liquidated. His reputation was destroyed. Catherine should have felt something. Satisfaction. Victory. Something. But she didn't. She just felt nothing. Andrew's downfall wasn't her victory. It was just his failure. The inevitable result of his choices. His arrogance. His refusal to learn. To change. To be better. She deleted the alert. Went back to work. She had a client presentation in an hour. A new deal to close. A future to build. Andrew's story was over. But hers was just beginning. 5 years later, Catherine was featured in Forbes. The consultant who revolutionized strategic advisory. The article talked about her company, her clients, her success. It mentioned her divorce in passing, but it didn't focus on it. Because Catherine's story wasn't about Andrew anymore. It was about her. What she'd built. Who she'd become. She kept a copy of that article on her desk. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that the people who underestimate you are giving you a gift. They're showing you what you're capable of. They're forcing you to become stronger, better, more resilient. And when you take that gift and turn it into success, when you prove them wrong not with words but with action, that's when you truly win. Andrew reached out once. After the Forbes article. A simple email. I'm sorry for everything. You deserved better. Congratulations on your success. Catherine read it. Then she archived it without responding. Because she didn't need his apology. She didn't need his acknowledgement. She'd moved on. Completely. Totally. And that was the real ending to their story. Not revenge. Not justice. Just indifference. The ultimate power move. She was free. And that was all that mattered. Catherine's story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclaiming yourself. It's about realizing that the person who leaves you isn't taking anything away. They're giving you permission to become who you were always meant to be. Without compromise. Without apology. Without limitation. If you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for staying. For listening. For caring about Catherine's journey. That means everything. So hit that like button one more time. Leave a comment telling me what you learned from this story. Subscribe if you haven't already because trust me, we're just getting started. And share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's going through their own version of what Catherine went through. Someone who needs to be reminded that being underestimated isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of something better. Until next time, stay strong. Stay patient. Thanks for watching.